the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Hey, gang. Hello. How are you? Welcome to the show. I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you for being here. Man, do I offer all of you guys and gals thank you, because you have made this podcast the 27th most popular podcast in the world, something like that. It's crazy. Just in 3 weeks, it's been all because of you. I'm really glad you enjoy the show, but your loyalty and your stick-to-itiveness with the little podcast that could has helped turn us into a hit, at least out of the gate. I am humbled and so thankful for your loyalty and your interest and just the feedback and the fun that we've had so far. Really looking forward to the entire year. Just way exceeded my wildest expectations when I made this move, leaving what was a great job that I had for 8 years to do this venture and go on this trip with you guys. And man, it's incredible. Thank you so much. Can't ever really repay you. Hope you'll keep listening. Hope you enjoy it. Hope you'll subscribe. Oh, you see that? You see how he quickly turned it from gratitude to starting to ask for stuff? Boy, I hope they'll subscribe, because then I get more downloads. And, you know, I promise you one thing. I am not living and dying by iTunes charts or anything else. That is not what this is about. It's nice. It's great that it's been successful. It's great that it's exceeded my expectations. But, you know, I can't be looking at numbers like that every day. It's not healthy. It's not going to lead to a better show. I'm really interested in making a good show that all of you will enjoy. And hopefully, you know, we'll keep fantasy football in the right perspective, which is that it's silly and nonsensical, but a lot of fun and entertainment, and, you know, fun to obsess over little things in life to avoid maybe some of the less pleasant things in life. And, you know, mostly just, this is a long way of saying thank you, and let's get to this show and stop being a maudlin idiot.
Today's kickoff.
On today's show, we will continue our update of position previews. Mostly we're going to tackle wide receivers. We did a 2-part wide receiver preview a few weeks ago. I encourage you to listen to those shows for a fuller sense of what I think of receivers this year. Talked a lot of specific names, draft strategy, that kind of thing. Today, after these 3 weeks now, I'm going to revisit to talk about what players have changed in my ranks. I'm also going to briefly touch on quarterbacks, briefly because, let's face it, not that much has changed when it comes to QBs. And also, they have their own preview podcast from a couple weeks ago, and you can listen to that. We'll have a mailbag, and yes, another voicemail from Sunk by a Hug. And then Allie Fontana will be on to continue the conversation about wide receivers. Allie is a gadfly of the fantasy world. She's a regular on a bunch of podcasts and sites. Looking forward to that.
Injury news.
So we wrapped up Tuesday's show, had a lovely talk with the fantasy footballers about changes to our running back evaluations, and in particular, at one moment, we talked about how LaShawn McCoy's ceiling might not feel that high in the Buffalo offense, but at least his floor felt really, really safe. Of course, whenever you say that about a player, you're acknowledging that they're safe except for the possibility of injury, and sure enough, just a few hours after that conversation, Shady McCoy came off the scrimmage field with a hamstring injury and set my Twitter account ablaze at Harris Football. You can follow me. As of this recording, we don't know much more than that McCoy is headed for an MRI, which would certainly lead one to believe that his preseason is over. Is week 1 in jeopardy? We don't know that yet. It's easy to imagine a scenario where it is. It's also easy to imagine a scenario where it isn't. So I haven't changed my shady rank as of this morning. But that's a little bit of a cheat, and I admit it. If I had to do a draft right now, would I still leave McCoy 12th overall in standard scoring and 18th overall in PPR? I would not. There is too much risk. I would probably have to wait to take him. But because I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the analyst who overreacts to every fart and sniffle and tells you to run for the hills. I'm resisting the urge to lower Shady until I see another report. Heck, by the time you listen to this, there's a decent chance we'll already have another report. And I'll say this. Since I know from my days at the Worldwide Leader that the majority of drafts take place over the weekend, I will most certainly address McCoy in my ranks before this weekend, probably lowering him, but we'll see what news we get here in the next day or two. But yes, even though he hasn't changed in my ranks as of my recording this, as of this exact moment, I admit he's got what we would call real downward mobility. So let the speculation begin. What would become of that Buffalo backfield if McCoy can't go week 1? Well, good old 34-year-old Fred Jackson's still hanging around. And can I mention that 34 being old is sad. Makes me sad. To some of you, it seems very old, I know. It does not seem that old to me. But anyway, so Jackson, he hurt a hamstring too a couple weeks ago. Hasn't done much of anything in training camp. Folks covering Bills camp have said that rookie Carlos Williams has actually looked like the best candidate for at least the number 3 job, if not the number 2 job. But he had to have undisclosed surgery this week and is out for at least a couple of weeks. Though the team sounds hopeful he'll be back week 1. Anthony Dixon, severe calf injury, can't practice or play, seems unlikely to be ready week 1. Bryce Brown, all we hear is how the Bills are mad at him because he fumbles a lot at practice. In other words, total mess. Honestly, there's no knowing how this would shake out if the Bills are Shady-free. So great, let's presuppose Carlos Williams gets right and can play week 1. Do we really think the Bills are handing over the keys to a rookie who hasn't practiced in the better part of a month? And could you use him in a fantasy lineup even if you suspect that might be the case? I don't know, man. Right now, I think you have to hold tight here. There's no obvious solution. As far as I can tell, at least as of right now, nobody you should be rushing out to add if you already drafted or if you're in a dynasty league. So let's get to some draft strategy updates and some player ranks updates. So, I'll knock out the quarterback position without much of a sweat. As of now, most potential fantasy starters have played like 10 snaps in the preseason. Nothing much has changed at the top. Tom Brady's saga continues. I continue to think there's no way he's serving 4 games. And while he probably can't be a top 5 draft option with all this uncertainty, he belongs to the group of QBs I'm fine if I get them once I decided to wait to grab my signal caller. Actually, a quick divergence. Let me be clear about waiting on quarterbacks because I get tweeted these questions over and over. No, if you're in a league that starts 2 quarterbacks, waiting isn't as viable a strategy. Why do I say wait on quarterback and tight end and defense and kicker in standard leagues? Because there's no scarcity. At this point, you literally should be listening along with this podcast and be able to mouth the words with me because there's no scarcity. Once you inject scarcity, as in every possible NFL starting quarterback is going to be owned in my league because everyone needs 3, of course, at that point, the universe changes. Now at least 2 QBs probably should go in the first round, and the top 10 quarterbacks almost certainly should be off the board in the 3rd, 4th, 5th. I'm probably not going to do a whole show on 2 quarterback leagues because that's really the extent of my advice. Not scarce, draft earlier. All right, getting back to quarterbacks. I mean, you've got Geno Smith out and Ryan Fitzpatrick in. Maybe that's good news. I don't know. For Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker, Jason Amaro. But who really knows? Fitzpatrick is a crazy person. He's a wild man. A maverick. He'll try and thread it into the tiniest of windows. Sometimes that does lead to high upside games. And his receivers have big weeks, but sometimes it leads to disasters. I didn't move the Jets receivers up as a result. The Bills seem to be considering Tyrod Taylor as their starter at quarterback, and that's a little interesting for fantasy because Taylor's a legit runner. Is he really a legit thrower? I have my doubts. You remember Terrell Pryor's glorious run for a few games as the Raiders quarterback a couple years ago. That's probably what we're looking at as an upside for Taylor in a pinch in 2 quarterback leagues. He might be interesting. I'm skeptical he'll be a fantasy force. I'm skeptical they'll win a bunch of games with him at quarterback. So I'm skeptical he keeps that job if he wins it. As an emergency situation, though, running quarterbacks, that's one area where fantasy evaluation is different than just flat-out NFL evaluation. Mostly it's like 95% overlap between those two things, but the one area is running quarterbacks because they are worth a bunch. All right, that was more time than I expected to spend on quarterbacks. Let's talk about wide receivers. There aren't a ton of receivers that I would say, man, massive changes in evaluation, so let's instead talk about strategy at greater length. And we'll start at the top of your draft. Something else I get asked all the time is you're pointing out all these warts, Harris. You're saying these 5 or 6 running backs, they should be the first picks in the draft, but they all have such warts. Le'Veon Bell suspended, Marshawn Lynch workload, Peterson's age and being out of football, Charles's workload being reduced, all that stuff. Then why, oh why, shouldn't I just bypass this mess, take a receiver no matter where I'm picking in the first round, and then trust I can figure stuff out at running back later in the draft or on the waiver wire? And I'm using a mocking voice. I'm not mocking that argument at all. It's totally fine. I'll never say it's the wrong strategy. Another thing I get asked a lot is a lot of you want to know what I think of the so-called zero running back strategy, as if it's some revolutionary dogma that's setting fantasy world on its ear. And to that I say, arg, it's perfectly fine to leave what you perceive to be risky running backs alone earlier in your draft and take what you perceive to be less risky receivers instead. Your ability to compensate by only taking running backs from, say, round 5 and then thereafter is often very much dictated by the quality of your league. If you've got a bunch of suckers who don't draft well and who don't stay on top of the waiver wire, and you typically have your choice of all the undrafted free agents when they start to make noise in week 3, rock on. The leagues I'm in tend to be populated by people who are good at the game and like paying attention. So I'm not just going to have my pick of the litter like, oh, there's C.J. Anderson, there's Justin Forsett, oh, look, there's Jeremy Hill, there's Alfred Morris. I'll just pick them all up, no problem. But the larger point is that within reason, you can make almost any strategy work, because fantasy football isn't about what position you're going to take next. Seriously, stop asking me that question. Should I go wide receiver in the first 2 rounds? I'm at the end of my draft. Should I go QBWR or WRWR or RBWR? Arg. Those are, I hate to say, kind of dumb questions, kids. I'm sorry to say it. I can't tell you what positions you should take. I can only tell you what players, and even then, it's really hard. But at least you're talking about concrete things. We're talking about players. I can't tell you what position to take because it depends which players have gone off the board before you select. You can make any strategy work if your player evaluation is good and you wind up picking players who wind up having a lot of talent and good playing time and good health. If I'm choosing between DeMarco Murray and Demaryius Thomas near the end of the first round, I'm perfectly okay if you personally evaluate Thomas as more of a sure thing and you feel capable of getting enough running backs later or in free agency that you take Thomas. Don't translate that to mean I'm telling you, oh, take the wide receiver over the running back. If you're picking first overall and you've got your choice of every single player in standard scoring, am I going to say take the wide receiver over the running back? I'm going to say take the running back, not because he's a running back, but because those particular players who are available I trust a lot, and I think their position is really scarce. So please, even though I know I can't fully stop the torrent of positional draft questions, if you're tempted to tweet me those, go ahead and stop yourself. Now, who are the wideouts whose ranks I've changed over the past few weeks? Well, the big ones are Kevin White and Breshad Perriman, a pair of highly drafted rookie receivers who seem to have big roles available for them. I started my ranks this summer, and White was my number one rookie receiver ahead of Amari Cooper because of the freaky raw talent and the great opportunity. But of course, now he's had surgery on a stress reaction in his shin. He's missing all of training camp. He's missing a big part of the season, maybe the entire season. He's not worth taking in a redraft league. Correspondingly, the Bears need someone opposite Alshon Jeffrey, and Eddie Royal, probably best suited to run out of the slot, but he seems like the best bet to pick up some production. I don't have him rated where I would have had Kevin White rated, I'll tell you that, but I have him as a borderline top 50 receiver, a low ceiling, not someone to consider in the first half of your 12-team draft, but not a horrible bye-week guy to have on your bench. Perriman, similar story. He hasn't been ruled out for anything yet, but there's no longer much of a chance that he'll be a major fantasy factor out of the gate. He's dealing with knee swelling, even though an MRI came back negative for anything that would require surgery. Perriman has not been able to practice at all, and barring a fairly major turnaround, it seems unlikely he'll be much of an option as a fantasy starter right away. I still have him in the mid-40s among receivers. I think he should be taken in all drafts as a stash because of that athletic potential. And there's a lot of vacancy there in Baltimore. I don't have any of those other receivers as being reliable enough to plug in your starting lineup week one. I mean, Steve Smith started last year hot. I guess you could say he benefits. I didn't hike him in my ranks, but if I was going to take a chance on anybody week one, it would be Steve Smith. A few more names. Michael Coleman fracturing some fingers. That sort of moved the logjam among Cardinals receivers for the moment, adding a little more sheen to John Brown as a high upside sleeper. Victor Cruz probably deserves an upward bump. It's impressive that he's able to participate in camp. But I do remain skeptical that, we don't want to get fooled by rosy reports. Cruz-like production, the kind of production that we imagined, that we used to get from Victor Cruz, still seems like that's tough to imagine for me. A torn patellar tendon is just a terrible injury for a receiver. I may still be too low on Cruz, but I'm going to take chances on other players in later rounds. And if Cruz winds up, sort of being the exception to the rule as far as this injury goes, I'll be surprised, and that's okay. That someone else will benefit and I won't, and I think I'm okay with that. Brandon Coleman, the last name I want to talk about here, of the Saints, turned into an interesting final few round sleeper in 12-team leagues. I have a feeling there's a chance you're going to be hearing his name when we talk super deep next week. Coleman has been a camp standout all summer. Seems to have bypassed Nick Toon for the number 3 job behind Brandon Cooks and Marcus Colston. And let's face it, neither Cooks nor Colston is a lock to be productive. They have their respective questions. You're not starting Coleman anytime soon, but he's a very big kid with pretty good wheels, catching passes from Drew Brees, and they use a lot of 3 receiver formations. So at least Coleman's a name to track. He's an interesting name that if there's some production there at the beginning of the year, he might wind up being addable in a lot of leagues.
Time for the mailbag.
One thing I wanted to note is that apparently we've gotten a fair number of questions from folks who are looking to replicate La Liga Lebowski and start a Super Dynasty League of their own. The best way to get questions about setup and stuff answered is follow at La Liga Lebowski on Twitter. Colin has graciously agreed to answer whatever questions he can via that mechanism. I should also mention that there is a Harris Football Podcast fan page. If you're more of a Facebook person than a Twitter person, there is a fan page. You can also follow me on Facebook. I'm Facebook.com/Harris Football. But to be honest, I don't have tons of time to answer questions there. The place to go is actually the fan page. A very kind gentleman named Brian Wagers has started it up and put some work into it. He's starting listener leagues. So if you're interested in being in leagues with other fans of the podcast, please go to that page. Just look up Harris Football fan page on Facebook. Brian has got you hooked up there. In addition, I'm not positive the leagues are still open, but Brian has been organizing at least one, if not more than one, Lebowski clone league. And if you're interested in being in one where there's already a commission, they're looking for owners, go to that fan page. It's a good place just to comment on each other's teams and questions and stuff like that. Basically, if you've been frustrated because I just can't get to your emails, which I just can't. There's just not enough time in the day. There's so many emails. You can get some smart folks weighing in on your conundrums if you go to that fan page that Brian set up, because he's a really nice dude. I don't actually know him, but we've now corresponded a bunch. Really nice guy. So I know what you're waiting for. Let's hear a voicemail.
Hey, I'm down in Atlanta, Georgia, and I just saw Christopher Harris at Target offering to give people hugs for his podcast popularity. If you can get back to me so that we can get this situation under control, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.
Aha, there you go. The mystery of how this podcast became so popular so quickly has obviously been solved. I have been roaming the countryside exchanging hugs for downloads. It's a scandal. You can expect to read about it on Deadspin anytime. Remember, you can call in your me sighting and talk about the chaos that I'm causing. Call 786-529-2484, a number you do not need to remember because it spells out sunk by a hug. That's sunk by a hug. Let's get to the rest of the feedback from you folks. Tyler Watts sends an email saying, I wanted to tell you that I saw you outside the nearby bus station eating what looked like a burger you had retrieved from a dumpster. I yelled, "Hey, Harris," but you just rolled your eyes. I would have called this in, but I couldn't figure out if the number was sunk by hugs or sunk by a hug. Love the daily podcast and keep up the great work. It is actually sunk by a hug. I'm sure I have messed it up on previous podcasts, mainly because I cannot believe it is a thing that exists in the world. A tweet. This is actually not a meme tweet. This is a football-related tweet. I'm going to read it on the air. You guys are probably steering off the road in surprise right now. Alan Scamfer says, I have heard you mention crutch arguments. It might be a good podcast topic to define this term and give some examples. That's right, because sometimes I do forget that people are discovering us along the way and not kind of with us from way back. Crutch arguments are arguments that are kind of baloney and arguments that people retrofit because they have an opinion and they're looking for something that sounds smart to say. I will give you some examples. Quarterback X has an advantage because his team is always playing from behind. Running back X is at a disadvantage because his team is always playing from behind. Oh, those guys have a bad running game. You want that quarterback because those guys have to throw. They finally got a good second wideout. That means the first wideout is going to see less double coverage, and so his production is going to get better. Don't draft that running back. He's not going to get any goal line carries. Now, all of those things could be true, but they aren't always necessarily true. Sometimes offenses are just bad. It doesn't matter if you're behind or ahead. You don't want Blake Bortles even if their Jags are trailing all the time. How about they wouldn't have taken him in the first or second round if they didn't plan on playing him as a rookie? Well, sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's totally not. How about they drafted for the offensive line this year, so for sure that means the offense is going to get better. The running game, the quarterback won't have as many sacks. They have highly drafted rookie offensive linemen. Again, sometimes true, sometimes not. So when you hear me say crutch argument in the course of this podcast, I'm talking about, I'll be kind and say baloney, that people often say in service of an argument that they kind of believe anyway and are just finding things that make them sound like they have some evidence, even though that evidence is by no means conclusive.
Today's guest.
And today's guest is Allie Fontana, and you can find her work on the Fantasy Fix. And Allie, you have also the distinction of being the first and only woman to win the Fantasy Sports Writing Association Football Article of the Year in print. So we are really happy to have you on. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Christopher. It's great to join you on your new venture, a 3-week-old venture, I guess it is now.
It is 3 weeks. Yeah, thanks for being here. And we've spent the first part of the show. I think if an independent arbiter would do an assessment of the first part of the show, it would be Chris Harris being a scold, trying to tell people not to ask him certain kinds of questions. So it's been a scintillating first half. I'm sure you're going to elevate the discourse here. And we're talking wide receivers, maybe guys who our opinions have changed of them over the course of the first 3 weeks of training camp, and or just kind of players in interesting circumstances. I think first and foremost, I've talked about some of the injury receivers. How do you look at Kevin White, Breshad, Perriman, big rookie names who we had high hopes for, and now we have real questions about whether they're even draftable?
Yeah, well, I think on Kevin White, for me, he's kind of off the board in season-long leagues. And it's a shame because we had such high hopes as him for him
right.
This season. But right now, I saw in some of the early drafts I did, he was going, in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, which was kind of early for my taste, even though I really do like taking a shot on rookie receivers. Sometimes you have to look and see if that value is going to be there, or make sure that if they don't hit immediately, that, you have the bandwidth elsewhere in your roster to sort of wait on that player. Because what we've seen in the past is that sometimes these hot prospects get drafted in, those middle rounds, and then they don't pan out. In the meantime, then injury hits, and then those players get dropped by the team that drafted them because they just can't hold on to them, which then makes for a great opportunity for like an Odell Beckham, which happened to me in a few leagues last year. I didn't draft him because, he wasn't healthy, and other people got him before I did, but then I'm sort of a waiver wire troll.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And I look for people that have been dropped that I do like, and that, as the season goes on. So, if Kevin White's situation doesn't turn out to be, he's having surgery, right, to repair his shin.
Right.
And we know that he's going to be out for half the season. So for me, he's kind of off my board in your typical redraft season-long league.
Yeah, where are you thinking about him for Dynasty? If you had a rookie draft for Dynasty, we know how talented he is. You don't need him this year because in most rookie Dynasty drafts, you're not probably relying on your rookies to contribute right away. Talent? Do you think enough of the talent of the West Virginia tape and the situation in Chicago with Jay Cutler and such? Do you imagine that he's a productive player worth hanging on to for year 2 and 3?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd probably put him, in, let's see, after Cooper, Perriman, Aguilar, and White. I kind of have him sort of bunched together like that. It'll be interesting, though, to see if Cutler will be there. Let's say White doesn't play this year. Will Cutler even be there next season?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that is a question. And
there
then
are some unknowns.
Right. As far as Perriman goes, I've sort of been of the school that still draftable in all leagues because we don't have, at least when we're recording this, we don't have clarity. The MRI on Perriman comes back negative. He still has knee swelling. Hard to imagine he's a superstar week 1, but a chance for him to contribute at some point in the year. Do you feel like you want to take the risk on Perriman? And if so, if you're in a 12-team league, what round do you feel comfortable taking pulling the trigger?
Yes, I absolutely still like him. Obviously, given that he's missed reps and he's not on the field, that does sort of prohibit his ability to make an immediate impact. But just bear with me. I was looking on Fantasy Football Calculator this morning about where players were going.
Sure, ADP.
And I think he has a 10th round ADP, but when you in PPR, which I think is fine, because if you want to get him on your roster and you've obviously have your starters in place, you can always take Perriman if you think he'll make an impact, and then sort of if you need more of a steady Eddie type player. Yesterday, for example, I took Perriman and then I took Eddie Royal.
What round did you take Perriman in?
I took Perriman in the 11th.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you can get him in the 11th, it seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, there's upside there that if he's right, if he gets right, he could be the number one receiver and a touchdown maker in an offense that really needs one.
Yeah, so I think you kind of look around sort of the landscape and you see who's there, and available to you. And, if he doesn't pan out,
yeah, you can dump him. Yeah, sure.
It's not costing me that much, and there'll be somebody else that'll emerge.
Right.
So
I think we're sort of on the same page that we're in lottery ticket land with Perriman. We're looking for upside plays. I mean, if I have a choice between, a Breshad Perriman and you said Eddie Royal, or a Breshad Perriman, or I'm trying to think of just some sort of Malcolm Floyd, like players who maybe don't have the upside to be superstars, probably have a better chance of finishing the year with more fantasy points than Perriman, but don't have that crazy upside. We'd rather take the crazy upside guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always looking for that, especially if it's, more of a low risk, if it doesn't work out kind of thing.
Sure, later round, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we were talking before we actually pressed record, and we were trying to come, I had the same conundrum for the first half of the show. It's like, yeah, I don't see a ton of reassessment that I need to do except for based on injury. Is that probably right? You haven't looked at your receiver ranks and said, "Oh my goodness, I really need to move number 30 to number 10. I've totally messed this up."
No, nothing that's coming out like that. I mean, one guy that comes to mind simply because his ADP is the 6th round, and that's Victor Cruz. Now, the patellar tendons, injury and surgery to me, he's kind of, I won't say fully that he's on a do not draft list, because I think to some degree everybody is of value at a certain place in the draft.
Right. You can pick up anybody at the right price.
And the major thing is, though, we haven't seen what he looks like. Now, there was a report that came out yesterday that says he's possibly going to play in the second preseason game, and of course you want to look at him and does he pass the eyeball test? I think the 6th round is a little rich for me because, again, I'm looking at who's sort of available in that same round. You have, an Allen Robinson or Macklin, Deshaun Jackson, Aguilar.
Literally every single guy should go way ahead of Victor Cruz.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to count on the Victor Cruz recovery at that price.
Totally. We are on the same page. I neglected to mention that I briefly mentioned Cruz off the top 2, and I couldn't agree more. It's an injury not to be trifled with, and people who are rosy about how amazing he looks, it just feels like camp speak. So let me just I'm interested in your opinion on a few situations that feel like, at least media-wise, have turned a little gnarly, and maybe they just aren't gnarly and it's just people looking for something to write about. The Pittsburgh one is the one that comes to mind, because having watched the tape on Martavis Bryant and seeing in small sample size that he is one of those prototypical big-bodied, good speed, get down the field, be a red zone guy, well, he's the one who's really interesting for fantasy. And then you hear all the talk about how, no, Marcus Wheaton, he's going to be the number 2, and, Bryant will be lucky to work his way in as the number 3. From a fantasy drafting perspective, am I crazy to still not really be interested in Wheaton at all, despite all this talk, and be thinking I still want Martavis Bryant?
No, I don't think so. I mean, again, it's about sort of the price point. Now, in making lemonade out of the potential lemon, let's say, that we've been forced to suck on,
right,
after all of the effusive praise that Roethlisberger, had for Wheaton, which could also have been sort of overblown and out of context.
Right.
Just last night, there was a headline that said, Wheaton expected to start over Bryant. I saw this all over, the web.
Yeah.
And when I sort of sourced where that came from, Ed Breshad, who covers the Steelers, I believe it for the Pittsburgh Press Gazette, I think that's the paper, he had a chat with some Pittsburgh fans, and somebody asked him about this, and this basically what he said, that he expects. So now this is a headline. on, all of these different sites. So in making the lemonade, if it drives Bryant's, ADP down a round or so, I'm not going to complain about that.
You're just going to swoop, right?
Because it gets, it gives you, in other words, the risk is if he doesn't deliver. I mean, if you're drafting Bryant, you sort of know that he's going to have some big games, but there might be kind of a fallow, you have to endure maybe coming up short, but he's going to make big plays. And I'm, I like him as a 3 if I could get him as a 3, but, I may not be able to depending on how my draft goes and et cetera. And honestly, though, I'm not against Wheaton as a late round lottery. I mean, if your choice is, because I looked at where Wheaton was going, and if you look at his ADP, he's currently, and this could change, but somebody, Percy Harvin, no way. Marvin Jones is available. I might take a shot on Jones over Wheaton. Michael Crabtree, do you believe his great camp hype?
Yeah.
So it's relative, but I do think that, again, sometimes reporters or one thing I might disagree with you on just a slight bit.
Yeah.
I think in your when this comparison first came out, I mean, I do agree that I don't listen too much to what other players say about somebody else breaking out. And so, the Big Ben has kind of made some positive statements about Wheaton. But I did remember and recall back a few times with certain quarterbacks. Like I remember Peyton Manning talking up Austin Collie. Well, I don't remember. It might have been 2010 or 2011. It was the year that Collie sort of broke. And I think when a quarterback like Manning sort of talks somebody up, they're not just kind of blowing smoke. So there could be some there.
Yeah.
But not in the sense that suddenly everything we thought about Bryant goes out the window and we just sort of zero in on Wheaton. I mean, if Wheaton's ADP drops to 10 or something like that, I mean, I wouldn't draft him there myself unless I saw something on the field that was sustainable. And last year people were talking about Wheaton and nothing happened.
Yep. He was a flag player of mine last year, and that did not exactly work out. And by the way, the year that Austin Collie broke really is the year that Austin Collie broke, if you know what I'm saying. Yeah. He did break.
It was not very nice, I guess, but that's true. But he had that season.
No, you're right. I can't disagree. Unfortunately, he did break. There's been more talk. I mean, again, we're parsing, and I hate parsing. Anybody who knows my work knows that this is not what I want to do, spend time parsing what coaches say and players say, and media guys quote coaches and players as saying. But conversation about the Eagles situation, where we have Jordan Matthews almost catch a long touchdown, except it's a terribly thrown ball by Mark Sanchez. Very next play, I think, Nelson Aguilar catches another terrible throw from Mark Sanchez and takes it for a touchdown. If the roles had been reversed, maybe we'd be having a different narrative. It seems like somebody felt compelled to come out in Eagles camp in some way, shape, or form and say, don't worry. The offense is still going through Jordan Matthews. How do you assess these two guys? If you were going to talk about rounds where you feel comfortable taking them in 12-teamers, what would those rounds be?
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel good about both players.
Yeah.
Even if, if Matthew's going to be making his bones for you fantasy-wise, playing out of the slot, I mean, that's not a horrible thing if he's consistent. And, he certainly has some big play capabilities as well. So, I have taken Matthews happily in, sort of the fourth round.
Okay.
Because again, in some cases, people are doing these massive wide receiver runs and think people go pretty quickly. I've seen him off the board in the third round.
Probably too rich for your blood, but fourth you're okay with.
I am. I absolutely am.
Yeah.
And I think Aguilar, his ADP is sort of climbed to maybe like the mid to late 6th, early 7th in PPR. And honestly, as a third receiver, I'm willing to take a chance on him in that offense. As my third guy, would I want him to be my second receiver? Probably not, but, for certainly as a flex play or, again, there are some players, some veterans, for example, it's funny, there are like veterans that I will draft and then some of these guys, and I mean veterans, the older folk.
Sure. I know who you're going to say. I know you're going to say the Colstons and the Roddy Whites and those guys.
Well,
right?
No, I mean, actually there's some that I'm more inclined to draft than others, like Bolden, let's say.
Okay.
Colston, he really looked done last year.
He did to me too. Yeah.
But, so I mean, what I'm saying is even if I took Aguilar maybe a little bit early, I'd want to get, because some of these other guys aren't going nearly as early. I mean, you can get Bolden in the 9th round. So, at Colston as well, or I put Kendall Wright kind of in like a steady Eddie. He's not going to be in a great offense, but he's probably going to get a lot of targets. And he's somebody that might be able to get points. Eddie Royal, with Kevin White being a no-go, I think is going to be a really nice play for fantasy owners. So I do like Aguilar. I actually grew up in Philadelphia, so even though I haven't lived there in a very long time, I still bleed Eagles green. So I am hoping that to see some exciting things out of both players.
So, I mean, for me, I think I'm right with you there on Matthews, and for me, Aguilar, yeah, I mean, I would say I feel okay 7th round. I don't think I want to go any earlier than 7th round. Again, we're always talking 12-team drafts, but, and so, 7th round, you're probably not thinking of him as more than a flex. And okay, maybe that means I'm not getting him in a ton of leagues, but I'm okay with that. I don't think I want to pay the price where he has to be my number 2 wide receiver if I've waited on wide receivers. I think I do feel a little bit more comfortable with him as a flex. How worried are you, and is it reflected in your rank of Sammy Watkins, given the nonsense that's clearly being compiled in that Buffalo quarterback situation? I don't view it likely that there's anyone else in that Bills receiving core that's much of a threat to Watkins' primacy, but I certainly think it's worth wondering that if it's, Tyrod Taylor, can he even, he's a runner. He's not a great thrower. Does it cap how good you think Sammy Watkins can be?
I actually do. I have him at 26. And
among wide receivers or overall?
No, among wide receivers. And I know that's low, but
low? Yeah.
It is. It has nothing, it doesn't reflect his talent or his ball skills or anything like that. It's just the situation is so, ugly right now. I mean, even they don't have much around him. Every running back is down for the count right now. I mean, it's sort of like...
It is. It's like the drummer from Spinal Tap. It is.
Is this what they call Buffalo?
Yeah.
So, he wouldn't be a guy. I've passed on him. I just don't feel, I don't have a positive, vibe about it. And sometimes, again, and I'm talking about your season-long leagues. I mean, if he's on your dynasty roster, you're obviously hoping that something changes. He went pretty early last year. I think people were drafting him, and I remember fielding a ton of questions, on Twitter about it. Some people took him in the 4th or 5th round, maybe even reached a little early, and then some were dropping at a certain point in the season. So I said, for me, I'm not super optimistic about his situation. I do like the player.
Yeah. And, I have him as a 4th or a 5th this year, and I think I'm going to get, last year it was when we were thinking E.J. Manuel was still a viable prospect, and now that seems to have gone away, and, now there doesn't even seem to be a viable prospect. I mean, if the best case scenario for his receiving chops is Matt Castle. Oh my goodness. That is not a happy scenario. So I get it. I mean, I understand why your rank is low on him, but I'm going to be that Huckleberry this time around. Hey, Allie, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll come back.
I was really happy to be here and chat with you about receivers. I do recognize just, how important loading up on those talented upside wideouts are. And, they come at a premium. Boy, if you snooze, you lose on some of these guys. So.
No question. And folks can follow you on Twitter at Allie Fontana.
That's correct.
And I hope they do. And I hope you have a great beginning of your season. And we'll be listening for you on a wide range of podcasts. And we'll be reading you some on the Fantasy Fix and elsewhere. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
And that's it. That's our show. Thank you very much for listening. In the time we were making this fine program, word came down that Panthers receiver Kelvin Benjamin was carted off the practice field with a non-contact knee injury. Doesn't sound good. Certainly, I will have a lot more analysis and discussion of this in tomorrow's show. And it may also interest you to know that tomorrow's show will begin our countdown of my flag players for 2015. Hey, subscribe to the podcast. It helps us out. It's probably the number one thing you can do that will help the little podcast that could continue. In the meantime, have a great day, and we'll talk tomorrow.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.